You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. In the earlier years of the coronavirus pandemic, the role of police expanded to include the enforcement of public health safety regulations in congruence with local, state, and federal law. With citizens of their jurisdictions eager to escape quarantine and return to normal life, this was a challenging time. As the pandemic created a new norm for American citizens and law enforcement, changes were made and communities were impacted. This panel discussed the challenges of enforcing coronavirus regulations, the impact it had across different communities, and how that affected initiatives focused on more equitable policing. Part 1 begins with introductory comments by former CEO Marcia Ferranto and keynote speaker and former Boston Police Department Commissioner Ed Davis, followed by the first topic of conversation posed by the program's moderator, Ganesha Martin, defunding the police. And now for part 1 of equitable policing during the coronavirus pandemic.
The exploration of some of this country's most creative and thoughtful solutions to the challenges faced by our law enforcement is an important part of understanding the full story of American law enforcement, especially when law enforcement in our communities can work together to solve these challenges. We are fortunate to have this team of experts assembled today to discuss the challenges of enforcing coronavirus regulations, the impact it has had across different communities, and how that has affected initiatives that are focused on more equitable policing. We are able to bring this program to you today thanks to the generosity of the team at Target, who has been an event sponsor several times this year, and we are grateful for their continued support. Target's core values are aligned with connecting law enforcement with the communities they serve all around the nation, and we are honored to be partnering with Target. It is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker today, Commissioner Ed Davis. Commissioner Davis has served as a law enforcement officer for over 35 years and is the former police commissioner of Boston, most known as Boston's lead police official during the tragic marathon bombing, and for testifying before Congress about the bombing and the lessons learned. Prior to this role as commissioner, he also held the position of superintendent of the Lowell Police Department for 12 years after climbing the ranks from patrol officer beginning in 1978. Commissioner Davis has also worked internationally on police issues in Singapore, London, Northern Ireland, Jordan, and Israel. He has also served on the Police Executive Research Forum's Board of Directors and was the founding member and first president of the Massachusetts Major City Chiefs Association. Welcome, Commissioner Davis.
Thank you so much, Marcia. Thank you for that kind introduction. And my sincere thanks to you and Thomas for letting me be part of this impressive panel of people who are going to talk about something that is really an unprecedented challenge. I'm thrilled to be able to talk to my former colleagues after being out for 6 years, and I'm particularly thrilled that September 9th is the day that I'm here, because 42 years ago today, I walked into the Massachusetts Police Academy. So that was quite an experience and led to a very exciting career and an opportunity to serve the communities that I worked in that I'm very proud of. And of course, going into police academy in 1978 indicates that when I was in high school, there were a lot of protests going on in the 1960s. So I lived through that era, and I saw the difficulty that was occurring in the country around the Vietnam War, and the focus on the soldiers and what the country was doing. And this is a similar kind of a situation where it's clear that there are inequities in the United States, in our government, in our cities, that include policing, start with policing actually, and then go beyond into other areas like healthcare and particularly education. In my time in the police departments I've led, I spent a lot of time interacting with the commissioners of education and visited schools frequently, and the inequities there are shocking and need to be addressed. But like 1966 and 67 and 68, the community has identified law enforcement as sort of the point of the spear on these issues, and we are experiencing a very difficult time of legitimacy and trust. And I think it's extremely important, and I know that speaking to my colleagues across the country, there are strong efforts to reintroduce community policing to what we do, to concentrate on openness and trust and transparency, and make sure that when we do something, we explain to the community why we did it, and also retrain our officers to concentrate on de-escalation and better ways of dealing with the use of force, which is always controversial and never looks good when anybody is employing it. But unfortunately, it's a necessary part of what policing is all about, because frankly, when we tell somebody they're under arrest, very frequently they object to that proposition. So we've got to find a way to earn the public's trust and to have them understand that what we're doing is appropriate and necessary, but it first has to be appropriate and necessary. And I think that that's the challenge that we have. So the reason I talk about that at length is because it really is critical to this panel. This panel is talking about COVID response and the implementation and enforcement of health regulations that are focused on the community good. There clearly is scientific evidence that following guidelines that have been issued by the CDC and other health experts will save lives. And so we're being asked, the police are being asked to step into the role of enforcement along rules that are being implemented and promulgated by health officials. With the backdrop of the protests and the issues around trust of police, behind everything we do right now, that makes an already difficult job almost impossible. And I'll give you an example of where I have run into this myself in the last year. Starting in the second week of March, my company was called in to run command centers at various international organizations. John Hancock and Manulife Insurance, for instance. Another company was one of the top retailers in the world. I'm not at liberty to disclose the name, but they're a Fortune 100 company. And they asked us to really take over the command center in the initial response to COVID. And as part of that responsibility, we set up the command post, we were getting streams of intelligence from all over the country and different parts of the world where this retailer is located. And it became very clear very quickly that the common sense, legitimate orders and directions that were being put out by governors and public health directors across the country were not being followed very well. And I sat there with the CEO of this corporation, and we had a debate about how you deal with somebody who comes into your store that isn't following the guidelines that the state has issued. And quite frankly, we had honest conversations about the challenges that police departments were facing in enforcing these rules and some of the tragedies that were occurring around the country. I know there are people on this call that experienced some of these tragedies, and security people were assaulted, employees were assaulted, by individuals who had a strong sense of their constitutional rights and their lack of interest in masking up and doing other things. So how does a retailer deal with that? How can you start to enforce laws on your customers? Well, frankly, we made a decision after a lot of debate and discussion that we would take a pass on this, that we would not enforce these rules. We would put signs on the front door. We would request that people follow the rules, but we would never get ourselves in a confrontational situation. If someone ignored us and didn't want to cooperate with the rules, we flipped it off to the police, and that was a viable alternative for a major corporation in the United States who made a very, very thoughtful and researched response involving attorneys and police experts and retail experts. The bottom line was this: we were handing that back to the police and saying, this is your hot potato. There's nothing we can do that's going to help this situation, especially in the environment that we're seeing in cities. One of our stores was burnt to the ground in one of the initial protests, and we were all there that night when that was happening and felt quite hopeless and helpless when it was going on. But the bottom line is this: the police have an almost impossible job to do right now. There's the merging of the crisis of confidence in policing, as well as the crisis of COVID. And you know, like in the past, we're being brought in to do the difficult and almost impossible jobs. So I thank you all, the people who are on this call, and you know, I speak to my former colleagues from various departments who have stepped down. The police chief in LA, the police chief in New York, the police chief in Chicago, and we're all, you know, very happy that we're not in the business. But that happiness is also measured with real sympathy for the officers and the people who are out there trying to do this very difficult job in this almost impossible environment. And I want to thank you for your service and thank you for all the work that you do day in and day out. But let me just say that you will prevail here. The goodwill of the men and women who are in this profession, and most importantly, the good deeds that happen every single day across America because of the work that police do, will eventually rise to the top here. We need to make serious change. We need to identify and change practices that are not working or are overly oppressive. But at the same time, what we do is fundamental to the safety of this country. So I thank you all for your service.
Commissioner Davis, thank you so much for your remarks and for carving out time in your schedule today to be with us. It is very, very meaningful for us. Thank you.
Thank you much.
Okay, I would like to, at this point, introduce our moderator, Ganesha Martin. Most recently, Ganesha served as the director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, where she oversaw collaborative criminal justice efforts that included the Baltimore Police Department, Baltimore State's Attorney's Office, Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, U.S. Attorney's Office, the Judiciary, and several community groups. Ganesha is a lawyer who led the federal court-ordered consent decree reform efforts at the Baltimore Police Department from 2015 to 2018. As chief of the Department of Justice Compliance, Accountability, and External Affairs Division, Ganesha collaborated with DOJ Civil Rights Division attorneys that ultimately led to the consent decree. In her current consulting practice, Ganesha focuses on uniting communities of color and the police as she consults on consent decree compliance and police reform matters for police departments across the country. Ganesha, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I think both you and Thomas for putting together such an important panel on equitable policing. We don't find very many spaces where we can have this conversation, and I think it's important for us to be able to do that in a collaborative way. And so I do want to, encourage everyone who's joined us today and taken time out of their schedule, that not only to ask questions, but certainly if you've had these issues and you've been confronted with them in your own professional or personal life, to share some of the things that you've been able to do. So I always think it's important to talk about issues, and as Commissioner Davis talked about, these are tough. There's no easy one size fits all solutions. And so I hope that we can walk away today by utilizing our personal experiences to help each other in this tough work. Because at the end of the day, the police have stepped up to say they want to protect and serve communities, and we've got to hear from those communities and the police in order to come up with the solutions that we need. So thank you all for being here today. Just as a matter of protocol, we're going to have about 45 minutes or so where I'm going to ask questions of our panelists. And then we will have Q&A at the end. You certainly can feel free to add your questions to the chat, and they will be funneled to me as previously mentioned. So my first question is, the pandemic happened to coincide with the national defund movement. I think most of us would take issue with the term defund, but we would all welcome a conversation on the role of police when it comes to responding to public health related calls for service. From my experience, police would much rather not have to show up to move along homeless folks in a mental and behavioral health crisis or other folks who need services. They recognize that the gun and the badge and the taser that they show up with are not tools that are usually helpful in these situations, and really prefer professionals to come in and help with that. So to the panelists, talk to us about how this has shown up in your city and some ideas forward, perhaps in some ways that you have kind of dealt with this issue where police are often called to handle public health issues. Judge Ernie Hart, you sit at the intersection of a lot of these issues, and of course you're going to talk to us from a legal perspective. But have you seen these issues crop up there at NYPD?
Oh, you look at not only, I know the topic of our discussion is policing during COVID, but as you mentioned, and as the commissioner mentioned before, we have a cross section of COVID. We have the civil rights marches. That in New York, some of them were a little violent. And then you also had the defund police movement, which kind of like intersected at the same time. And one of the things that we have found, or at least I found in New York, was that these three issues kind of had different aspects, different advocates, and at the end of the day, the public discussion was all over the place. And when the public discussion is all over the place, it gives the police a very difficult time in terms of what to do. For example, in the beginning, when all this COVID stuff happened, the issue was, yes, the police, we have the infrastructure, we're the ones who are going to enforce whatever we had to enforce. The problem is, it was a constant drumbeat of executive orders by the governor and the mayor, and then us in my department interpreting what they meant, and then giving our police officers in the field some direction of how to enforce all these new rules and regulations. That in of itself was a heavy task. Couple that with all the protests that were happening just after the start of COVID, and the need to not only enforce social distancing, but the wearing of masks, et cetera. That made the job that much more complicated, and complicated in that you had everybody wanted a different thing. We should enforce masks. We shouldn't enforce masks. Social distancing. Well, here you should enforce social distancing, but not here. We had basically an open discussion between politicians and policymakers of what to do, and then the police, always in the middle, were trying to figure out what exactly we were supposed to be doing, and we couldn't. It was very difficult at times to make everybody happy. Mm-hmm. Then you have the defund police movement, which took hold a little bit in New York, in that the New York City Police Department budget was cut by $1.5 billion, even though I believe that the New York City budget is about 4%, 5% of the total New York City budget, which is much lower than other police departments around the country. $1.5 billion from anybody's budget is significant. And this defund movement came at a time when we were supposed to be enforcing the wearing of masks, the social distancing, et cetera. Part of that was we had no more overtime. And for those of you who are police officers out there, the police departments run on overtime. I mean, anything goes awry, anything, make an arrest, anything, it's overtime. So all these factors made the job of policing during this time very, very difficult. Now, New York City is engaged in trying to figure out a plan to open up restaurants. Restaurants have been closed for the most part. Restaurants and bars have been closed since March, I believe. Today, the governor indicated, from what I understand, that bars and restaurants could be open as of September 30th with 25% capacity. And the question was, who's going to enforce that? So again, you're going to have situations where if the police try to enforce it, that's one thing. Other people have argued maybe the health department should enforce things. So what I'm saying is this whole confluence of events and situations has made it quite an interesting time, certainly in New York City, but in any police department that has to deal with all these issues at the same time. In addition to the fact, the overall arching issue is, criminal justice reform, which we were engaged in before this. I was a judge. I sat in criminal court. I sat in New York State Supreme Court, and I'm the first one to tell you there needed to be criminal justice reform. Our bail laws were antiquated. They did not take into consideration some of the poor results that happened in the past. So again, another complication in policing. And then you have the police officers themselves. They're sitting around listening to all this, and they go, well, what are we supposed to do? Because like everybody, police officers are human beings just like everybody else, and everybody has an opinion on what to do. And then you have the unions. I'm just saying, it's a whole lot of things going on, and it's made policing during this time quite a task.
Yeah, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but to the point that you made, we were already dealing with in many of our in our communities strained relationships, and that's putting it mildly. And so when you have this confluence of, number one, different opinions of how things should be handled, number two, the distrust, number three, one of the things that we didn't talk about was increased violence, right? All these things coming together, it certainly does, make for a great opportunity for us to come out on the other side of this better, but certainly very difficult in the meantime. Professor Calloway, you come at this from a little bit different angle. Do you have anything for us on this subject?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here today and being a part of the conversation. And I do appreciate what the commissioner has to say. I am standing at this moment in time from a very different perspective than a lot of people on the panel. I'm a professor of criminal justice and spent 2 decades as a criminal defense attorney. And I somewhat disagree with some of the assumptions that are being made today about this moment that we're in. In some ways, it's unique and different, but overall, I feel like what's happening right now with the virus has just put a magnifying glass on policing and the community relationship with the police. I got involved in a case here in Cincinnati where an individual was arrested for violating the stay-at-home order. And the whole situation, I feel like, is a perfect example of some of the problems that we have in the way that we deploy our police to enforce public order laws. And so I don't think what happened in my case, which I'll tell you about in a second, but is any different than what happens every day when the police are coming into contact with someone who is trespassing or publicly intoxicated or homeless or doing a number of these public order offenses. But my client was out videotaping on his phone and putting on Facebook Live a bunch of people who were out at night in violation of the stay-at-home order. And he was making a bunch of public comments about how he felt about the stay-at-home order, which was not positive. And so the police were not even aware that that was happening. They did not show up to that event. They did not arrest anyone that was there. But the law enforcement and the prosecutor in our town got so upset about that they actually sent the police to that man's house. They tracked him down on social media, sent him to that man's house the next day, and arrested him for what he had done with his Facebook Live videoing really what other people were doing. I mean, he was out too, but there were a bunch of people out there. They put him in jail. And we know, if you're following the coronavirus, that the top 10 hotspots for coronavirus right now in the United States are all in jails or prisons. So they put him in a jail where there are people living in close quarters and corrections officers and people that have to do their work. And the prosecutor advocated and somehow secured a $350,000 bond for a Black man who was out in public in violation of a stay-at-home order, criticizing the stay-at-home order. And there was a lot of rhetoric from the law enforcement about how they hoped he just stayed in jail and died. And so that's when I got involved, because this $350,000 bond for a low-level nonviolent offense, I mean, just patently absurd. And when I started digging into it, I saw that this is back in May, there had been 20 arrests in Cincinnati for violations of the stay-at-home order. I have the numbers. 6 of those arrests were white, 14 were Black, in a city that is a large majority of white people. And so then I looked at the bonds, and almost 100% of the white people were released without a financial consequence. Less than 50% of Black people were released with out of financial consequence. And of course, this particular Black man had to pay $350,000 if he wanted to get out of jail. So there was a lot going on in our city around this, but you juxtapose that next to a bunch of white women out at parks, college students in stadiums doing athletics, white protesters on the steps of the courthouse without masks, spitting in people's faces. None of those people got arrested. Nobody said boo about any of that. And so there's a large percentage of the population, including a lot of researchers like myself, who look at that and say, yeah, it's coronavirus, but it's really just kind of reflective of what a lot of people are seeing in their communities already. And so I hear that what the commissioner and others are saying, but I also feel like this isn't really all that unique. And we need to, as others have said, stop relying on the police to create this idea of public safety in our communities. That this is not the role of the police. We shouldn't depend on the police for this. And when the police get involved, this is the kind of thing that is bound to happen because they have limited tools at their disposal, as other people have noted.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, we're going to get into a little bit into the panel. When I worked in the police department, the officers often told me, ma'am, we just told. And granted, there's discretion, and there's certainly, police officers that shouldn't have a badge and a gun, and there's police officers that would agree with that, but we also, I think, never really talk about the larger structure. I mean, it wasn't a police officer was told to go arrest that person. It was also a judge, no disrespect to the judge that we have on the panel, but it was a judge that agreed to the $350,000 bail. And so, like, I think what you're saying, the coronavirus has put a magnifying glass on a larger issue. But one of the things that I think needs to be discussed is really how police are used by the other governmental apparatus. And particularly while we're talking about fixing the relationship on one end, you can't then send them into a situation where they're almost inevitably going to be hated because of that.
Thanks for listening to this special Encore series where we took a look back at equitable policing during the coronavirus pandemic. Join us for the second part of this Encore series later this month when the topic of conversation shifts to community policing and how relationship building between communities and police is more difficult than it seems. We thank you for your support, and remember, our upcoming episode releases are every Wednesday, and published exclusively on Tuesdays is our monthly Icons episode. We hope you learned something from this episode and will join us next time for another edition of Encore, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. A special thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of Encore, a series from the Precinct 444 podcast network by the National Law Enforcement Museum. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.